Good evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Are you having deja vu? Tonight, I want to take you back, all the way back to the year 2001. Oh yes, that dark, shameful time for fashion at the turn of the millennium. And I'm not just talking about butterfly hair clips and rhinestones and super low-rise jeans, but for vampires as well. All the shiny black leather, the trench coats, the sunglasses at night. We didn't just see this aesthetic in vampire media, of course. The Matrix is probably the most responsible for deluding us into thinking this look was ever cool. But even Blade did it before the Matrix existed. It was just the style at the time. And if the 2001 film, The Breed, was about anything, it was style. Not to be confused with the 2006 film, The Breed, which is about evil dogs. No. The Breed, 2001, was, as Fangoria magazine put it so succinctly, vampires with guns. So many guns. Because vampire movies haven't been just vampire movies for decades now. The whole reason they continue to be so popular is the way they blend so well with other genres. Vampires are the chameleons of the monster world. So here we have a vampire action. As much as we may be tempted to write off this movie's aesthetic as a cheap copycat of Blade and or The Matrix, just look at that poster, and indeed it may have been influenced in that way on some level, as the husband and wife scriptwriting duo came from a huge comic book background. We mustn't overlook the background of its director. The Breed, 2001, you see, is a Michael Oblowitz film. Who is Michael Oblowitz, you ask? Well, clearly you are unfamiliar with the no-wave cinematic movement of the 1970s and 80s. No, not new wave. No wave. It was an underground filmmaking movement that emerged in Manhattan's East Village among the artsiest of avant-garde artistes. A form of guerrilla filmmaking, only even more stripped down and all about emphasizing texture and mood over less important things, like plot or acting. And for Michael Oblowitz, that meant noir. Artsy film noir that racked him up all kinds of time in the international film festival circuits. And many of his early films and shorts are even now in the permanent collection of New York's Museum of Modern Art. So modern, so art. He also directed a whole lot of commercials and music videos, but even his more mainstream films that came after the no-wave movement was ostensibly over still go ham on the noir. I say mainstream, but none of his films have ever had a theatrical release outside of tiny art house theaters, and even as genre coattail riding as it was, The Breed, 2001, never made it to the box office. It premiered on the Starz network and then quietly fizzled into obscurity. Not even fit for the direct-to-DVD bargain bins. You can actually stream it for $3.99 on YouTube, or for free on Amazon Prime right now if you wanted to. It's not a great movie even by made-for-TV standards, but it's worth a watch if you're into texture and mood and aesthetics. The film is set in a dystopian near future that the director says was inspired by Terry Gilliam's Brazil. And it has a very Blade Runner / 1984-esque vibe to it. Like if Russia won the Cold War and the world permanently reverted to 1940s gangster fashion in a vaguely Eastern European setting full of random Americans. On top of the heavily slathered noir, it also has a measure of good old turn of the millennium cyberpunk, especially in the obligatory vampire fetish club scenes. Because even in the burnt out husk of future totalitarian dystopia, vampires still gots to go clubbing. In bondage wear. Those poor actors look so uncomfortable. The breed in question is vampires. Surprise! In this ostensibly sci-fi take on vampires, they're not supernatural creatures, but instead a genetic offshoot of humans that naturally evolved and have secretly always existed alongside them. Though they live for hundreds of years, they can bear vampire children, but they can also turn humans into vampires the usual biting and blood-sucking way, like the bitten not born dichotomy in Blade. So make of that what you will, breed-wise and not supernatural-wise. The vampires have developed a blood substitute that allows them to live peacefully without harming humans, and most of them want to integrate into human society. They are working with the ominous totalitarian government to get to a place where they can come out in the open. But things get complicated when one rogue vampire starts brutally slaughtering girls in a blatant attempt to ruin public opinion of their race. Breed.
Not everybody was wild about this coming out of the closet routine.
The movie starts when clueless human cop Stephen Grant's partner gets his throat torn out by the mysterious fedora-wearing evil vampire. And Grant's boss pairs the poor, bewildered, and traumatized detective with a new straight-laced, by-the-books vampire partner, Aaron Gray. And they're on the case. Of course, it's hate at first sight. But it's a buddy cop movie, so what do you expect? One of the first other vampires Grant meets in his investigation is the only female character in the movie of note, so you know they're going to end up sleeping together. Yep, there they go. This is Lucy Westenra, and she is ancient and exotic and mysterious and has a hidden agenda that temporarily makes Grant feel like he was a fool to trust her, even though he never really did, and only sleeps with her because she's so sexy and alluring and exotic and...
I'm only human.
Normally, I would have no compunction about spoiling a movie that's almost 20 years old. Yes, 2001 was that long ago. Did I just make you feel ancient? You're welcome. But as I'm sure you've never seen this movie, and it is a murder mystery in the police procedural style, I'll be generous this time. People seem to either love or hate this movie. Nobody really thinks it's great, and considering it was shot in only 24 days with a mere budget of $4 million by a director known for prioritizing style over substance, that's no surprise. Fast and cheap and dirty, but, in an artistic way. Those who love it, though, tend to give it props for what it was trying to do with the vampire genre. And when it comes to vampire films, which, let's face it, are mostly pretty bad, a valiant attempt to say something with your vampires is at least what we hope for here on Vampire Reviews. The vampires as a breed are supposedly generally unfairly discriminated against. The movie goes as far as to compare them to the Jews during the Holocaust. Much of the imagery of the movie invokes the Eastern European ghettos of World War II, especially in the vampire community itself, Serenity. And to drive the comparison home, our main vampire cop, Aaron Gray, was literally a Polish Jewish human person during the Holocaust who lost his family to Nazi brutality before he was turned into a vampire. Vampires have been compared to Jews countless times throughout history in an utterly anti-Semitic way, framing Jews as blood-sucking monsters. Hitler made the comparison in Mein Kampf, and Dracula scholars have long called out Bram Stoker's depiction of the vampire for using anti-Semitic stereotypes. But even centuries before that, the metaphor of the Jewish vampire existed in medieval art, depicting them as literally consuming fresh Christian blood. What The Breed, 2001, tries to do is take this long-running harmful myth and turn it on its head. Here, the Jewish-coded vampires are a peaceful, misunderstood people, being propagandized against by the world around them. There's even a scene where we see them trying to smuggle themselves out of the country to escape the fascist government. But as Detective Grant's first introduction to them is the brutal slaughter of his partner, viewing their breed with sympathy is difficult for him. This is compounded by the fact that he is a black man who has experienced his own share of racial prejudice, and he does not feel the struggles of a people who historically drink human blood is comparable to his own. And he has a point. As noble an effort as the movie is trying to make, using a literal monster, such as a vampire, as a metaphor for an unjustly maligned race can be a bit sticky. The movie tries to make the allegory less problematic by having the majority of its vampires be innocent and good and only drink blood substitute now. But it's difficult to convince a movie-going audience to let go of all their preconceptions of the monstrousness of vampires, and that classic vampire connotation will always be there. Having a character like Grant address this issue in the movie itself shows the filmmakers were aware of the double-edged sword of their message, but Grant's meta-reaction doesn't solve the problem. And of course, even in this film, like humans, the vampires have a few bad members among their people, giving them a bad name. And what the movie does is offer this line to combat it.
If a Puerto Rican had killed your partner, what? You want to exterminate all Puerto Ricans?
To which Grant replies,
Puerto Ricans don't bench press trucks and drink blood.
acting.
You mean I've got to fit in with them?
But to the movie's credit, they don't just sweep the false equivalency under the rug with these lines. The bad vampires justify their hatred of humans by citing humanity's past brutalities.
He believes exposing ourselves to humans is suicidal.
Not believes, knows. I've seen witch hunts, slavery, the massacre of millions of Jews.
I saw with my own eyes what happened to the Indians, the Africans, the Jews.
And on the other side of it, Grant spends much of the movie dealing with his prejudice against the vampires and only very, very slowly coming to accept and sympathize with them. Though getting into Lucy's tight, shiny vinyl pants certainly helps him along. Despite some twists along the way, by the climax, Grant ends up taking the vampire's side over his own government, to the point where he even kind of wants to become a vampire himself. As heartwarming as this character growth for him is, it probably would have had a bit more impact if the human government wasn't painted as so sinister and big brothery from the start. But hey, Grant overcame the system he was raised in, so good for him. And it's his advocacy for the vampires that helps finally bring the two communities together.
The catastrophe that almost befell us could only have been created by mutual cooperation between our two people. And mutual cooperation is the only way it could have been stopped.
I guess the biggest twist here is that the ambiguously fascist government wasn't as evil as it could have been. Though they were developing a sort of final solution for the vampires, they chose not to go that route in the end. How benevolent! Such trope subversion. Wow! Speaking of tropes and homages, Lucy Westenra isn't the only vampire in this movie named after classic vampire-related people. We also have a Graf Orlok, a Seward, a Bathory, a Barbara Steele, and even a vampire named Cross for a fun dose of irony. These characters really bear no resemblance to their namesakes, though, and don't seem inspired by them in any way. Rather, the names seem like the film is simply saying, hey, we know other vampire media exists, and we're not trying to pretend that it doesn't. Like these classic names we use, these ideas are timeless. Perhaps to make us more accepting of all the other tropes and elements it borrows. Not only so obviously from the 1998 movie Blade, but plenty of other vampire properties that were big in the 90s, like Buffy and Angel, Forever Night, World of Darkness.
Begone! You tamper with forces far beyond your comprehension.
He didn't just say that.
Quit the NY's routine. We're not amused.
So self-aware, how droll. Vampire expectations are at odds with vampire reality. There's the vampire detective trope, the blood substitute, the conflict between vampires who want to integrate with humans and those who think they should dominate humans, the gun porn, the virus the shady Mengele-esque scientist concocts in his laboratory that could wipe out all vampires, the fashion and style, and of course, the oppressed minority allegory.
Not everybody was wild about this coming out of the closet routine.
This film makes no pretense about being the first to do any of these things, but it also didn't do them last. And a lot of these elements seem so cheesy and overdone to us now because they've been done so much more since this film came out. We saw a lot more of these tropes in the Underworld franchise, the Blade sequels and TV series, the way the Vampire the Masquerade continued to develop its aesthetic, and especially in the HBO show True Blood.
Now that the Japanese have perfected synthetic blood, which satisfies all of our nutritional needs, there is no reason for anyone to fear us. We just want to be part of mainstream society.
A lot of Americans don't think you people deserve special rights. There's a reason things are the way they are. Yeah, it's called injustice.
The Way, the Breed, 2001, both serves as a meta-commentary on how the vampire genre had previously been developing, as well as predates popular elements in later vampire media, is even mirrored in the film's setting, a future that looks like the past. Because so few people have seen this movie, the vampire media that followed probably wasn't exactly directly inspired by it in any way. Rather, these tropes and ideas were simply the inevitable evolution of the genre. Vampires are rarely monsters anymore, at least not just monsters. And the misunderstood minority struggle is a theme we see repeated over and over again with their stories. But that makes plenty of sense, even when you take race out of the metaphor. For instance, the sci-fi fantasy horror genres have always been made by and for nerds. People who have felt like outcasts. People who might identify with an oppressed, misunderstood, but secretly awesome character like this kind of vampire. Nerd culture has become more mainstream nowadays. In the year of our Dark Lord 2019, we are all proud to let our freak flags fly when it comes to geeky interests. But back in '01, this development was still kind of in its formative stages, and The Breed, 2001, was one of the stepping stones. The film ends with both the vampire and human communities agreeing that exterminating one another is not the solution. Wow! Who would have guessed? Although this movie is extremely heavy-handed with its oppression allegory, the dialogue is cheesy and comic booky, and much of the acting is sloppy and under-rehearsed. The message it delivers is still decent, and the mystery is intriguing, and the aesthetic is pretty cool. Hey, it has been almost 20 years. We are allowed to start being nostalgic for it again now, right? Yeah? Oh yeah. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and I make this look good. Speaking of The Breed, look what I made. You thought I was going to talk about my book again, didn't you? It's a baby. It's a baby. This is the part where I say thank you to my Patreon patrons for funding vampire reviews and try to talk all the rest of you into joining my Patreon. Look, I have more mouths to feed now, so much more blood to purchase with those Patreon dollars. Otherwise, just like this video, subscribe to my channel, leave us a comment for the algorithm, for the baby.